Welcome to the Teach Joyfully podcast, where we talk about all things elementary teaching with some mom stuff thrown in. I'm Lisa Burns, a teacher success coach, veteran elementary teacher, and mom of five. I'll be your host. Thanks for joining me. Today I have with me Julia Pappas. She's a psychologist, a parent coach, and also the host of the Parenting Presence podcast. She has over 15 years of experience working with parents and their children and has particular expertise in child development, behavior regulation, and learning needs. I met Julia a few years ago at a business event and have never looked back since. I find her to be a calm voice of clarity and reason, and you're going to love her.
So, Julia, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So today we're talking about setting limits and having boundaries. And so, Julia, tell me the difference. Let's start with the difference first about limits and boundaries. People confuse that.
Well, I would say it's one and the same. It's just the way we prefer to speak about it. Limit is really a boundary, and a boundary is really a limit. So it's a matter of what words do you choose to describe what's okay and what's not okay for you or in your space. If we're talking about a classroom, what are some limits in the classroom? What are some boundaries? Basically the same thing. And both of those refer to what's okay and what's not okay.
Perfect. Okay, so I deal with teachers, and because in the classroom, having boundaries in the classroom or setting limits or boundaries as you're working with students can be really difficult. And part of it starts with ourselves and not maybe understanding where we want those boundaries to be. So often teachers really struggle with that as they kind of get started. Where would you tell someone a starting place to say, okay, how can you start to figure out where your boundaries are?
In general, I think it's not just the classroom setting, right? In general, we sometimes feel awkward, feel like we don't have permission to set a boundary or set a limit. And it's done in a roundabout way, not in a direct manner. And so sometimes what happens is that we end up communicating about boundaries, limits, what's okay, what's not okay, in vague way, right? So it's just like not clear what is the expectation. So that's one thing. Asking yourself, do I have some sort of discomfort around talking about boundaries and limits? Do I feel like that's a bad thing? Sometimes people feel like limits are not a good thing. We should allow a lot, right? So we can see that in parenting as well. How do I allow things or not allow things and not come across as limiting? So a lot of the times we do the opposite, right? The same can happen in the classroom where if we're not clear what's okay, what's not okay, where's the boundary, what's the limit, then we end up having a chaotic classroom. So what ends up happening there? And chaos, again, it's like everyone can interpret it in their own way, right?
Sure.
What's a little bit of chaos tolerable and what's like not okay? For everyone, that will be a different level of comfort. But in some way, it ends up being a dysregulated classroom, right? If we don't have clear expectations. So what do we do at that point? We hammer down on this is not okay. And so it ends up being don't do this, don't do that, stop this, right? So kind of like very restrictive and almost like negative language in terms of what not to do, instead of starting from the get-go asking what's going to be okay in my classroom, what's not going to be okay, but framing it in the way of what do I want my students to do. And we can't do that unless we feel good about the idea of setting limits, right? And limits is really, think about like a yard, right? Why do we have schoolyards fenced around? So that we don't have children running off in places that they don't know don't belong to the school ground, right? Or our toys or like recess equipment not getting lost in the woods somewhere, right? So there is a boundary, a natural boundary that limits the space in which we feel safe. It's the space for this thing, and this is what the expectations are here. So if we have any sort of discomfort around the idea of setting limits, think about it like fencing around an area, saying this is okay, that's not okay. We're going to have a hard time talking about limits. And the way you talk about limits is basically setting an expectation. This is what would be acceptable. This is what is welcomed in this space.
Sure. And that makes perfect sense. I think definitely seeing it as like a schoolyard or even your own backyard, you have boundaries to that. And you maybe you like your neighbors, but you don't necessarily want their dog to be in your yard, right?
Mhm.
Or in your pool or anything else, right? You just kind of want to have some sort of personal space. So it is setting boundaries and doing that all the time. We don't really think about it that way, but it is for sure. Teachers and a lot of adults really do struggle with that idea of, feeling bad about setting boundaries, especially for children. I think so often we feel like we're being harsh or we're being mean. But if we start out with what we want to do and how we want things to run and having that very, very clear picture of how things ideally would run, then we can start to figure out where our boundaries are. But if we don't have any picture of exactly how we want our school day to go and how we want children to move around the classroom and to interact, or even if they're in an online classroom, how we want them to interact in an online classroom, it's really hard. And it is true. We just start becoming very harsh. And that's, I think, when we start feeling bad about it, because we do become very harsh and we realize that maybe we're being more reactive and suddenly we're doing things that maybe we didn't intend to do and acting in ways that we wouldn't have wanted to act like. And that's where I think that mentality of, "Well, I don't really want to limit them."
So what you're bringing up is really important because here's what happens. We think that by avoiding, and when I say we think, we don't consciously think, it's kind of like the process that happens on the back of our mind. So we think that by avoiding having a limits conversation, we can come across as nicer, a better teacher, everything is allowed, and we can somehow avoid that conversation about limits and not have to have it at all. But what ends up happening, boundaries is a very natural thing. It's like getting hungry. You're going to get hungry for boundaries at some point, right?
Right.
It's just a natural sense that we have as humans for order, because without the order we're going to have chaos, and that's like one person. But when you have 5 more, 10 more, 15 more, 20 more people in the same space, for all of them, now you definitely have to have structure and the sense of order, because that creates a sense of predictability. So if we don't have a conversation about limits, boundaries, expectations, because it's a natural thing to be happening to have boundaries, what we'll end up seeing is that the boundaries will be crossed. Whether we talk about it or not, they're going to be crossed. So at some point, we're going to feel resistance to what's happening, resentment for some students' behavior, feeling maybe completely disempowered because it's overwhelming. But so we need to understand that boundaries are there and they will be crossed unless we specifically clearly speak about it, right?
Right.
That's the thing, that it's not like we can really avoid experiencing boundaries. They'll be there and they will be crossed. So we have to talk about it proactively, understanding that because it's a natural thing for human beings, it does not need to be a harsh conversation.
Right.
It
Right.
only happens to be harsh when we feel like our boundaries are violated.
Sure.
But knowing that everyone needs to have a sense of predictability and control, that's a very natural conversation to have. So we have to approach it that way. Now, we
Right.
all want to feel safe, have fun. So, how can we make this happen for this community? You, the teacher, you guys, the students, how can we make this work for everyone?
Sure. And it's interesting too, because I'm all about having students have some sense of control and choice in a classroom, but I also think that someone has to be in charge. And there tends to be this trend to, okay, let's set the rules together and let's do this together, which it can be okay, but there's a point at which really someone has to take charge and say, no, these need to be the rules here. And this is how the classroom will be run, because as the teacher, if your boundaries are crossed, you're setting the weather in that classroom. And
Mhm.
it really needs to be according to how you're going to be able to manage and teach and feel so that you can help everyone else adjust, as opposed to
Yeah.
letting the children decide, well, this is okay, but this is not okay. When in fact, maybe that's not okay for the teacher. As the adult in the room and the person who is ultimately in charge, we really need to be in charge of that. Do you
Okay.
feel that that's
Yeah,
true?
I agree, because what we're looking at here is ultimately there's an adult who is responsible, right? So if some people feel almost like they're reacting to the word being in charge or being the one in control, right? Like the teacher is the ultimate authority and somehow that's bad. But if we flip it and think of it, like reframe it and think of it in terms of who has the most responsibility to make sure that things go well. When things don't go well, whom are we going to point to? Who are the students going to go to when things don't work out? They're going to come to an adult, right? They're going to come to you as a teacher. So that is clearly the signifier that you are in control, in charge. You are the one responsible. So, with that being said, of course, you want to create flexibility, you want to create a sense of community and have a dialogue. But ultimately, with our sense of responsibility, we have to filter everything through that and see what's really going to work. Because again, students are at the different stages of their development still very self-centered, and we have to teach them how to think about others as well as themselves, right?
Right.
And so they don't have that kind of perspective yet. So for someone who is overseeing the well-being of all the students in the classroom, that's where we have to come in and say, I love that idea. Now let's consider what kind of impact that's going to have. Let's consider our other voices, our other thoughts, and maybe their idea is great. But we don't just jump on it and say, yes, you came up with that. That's awesome. We're going to run with that. We're still going to run it through a process of how is that going to impact our broader community, right?
Right.
So for me, I love approaching that from this perspective of who is ultimately responsible. And we have to be able to have that influence and impact and be able to take things back into our control if things are not working out. And if we didn't start out that way, that ultimately I'm responsible for you guys and ultimately the responsibility is with me to make sure that this goes well, we won't be able to reclaim it when we let things to be a little looser, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And, I don't know the old adage is to go in and don't smile until November or whatever it is, right?
Oh my
It's just
gosh.
like, oh my gosh, that's like ancient ways of teaching. But we certainly don't want to be that person. But at the same time, we do want to be the person who has already gone in. And if some teachers really want to sit down with their kids and talk about possible rules and those kinds of things, that's not a problem. But you have to go in already knowing how you want your classroom to run and already knowing what's okay with you so that you can guide that conversation very strongly as opposed to just letting the freedom reign
Mhm.
throughout.
Well,
Yeah.
again, right? Thinking about responsibility. If the students don't know what they want, we always have to have options, right? How are we going to have options about what we want in the classroom if we have not thought it through on our own,
Sure.
right?
That's right.
So
That's
it's
right.
exactly what you're saying. We have to have an idea, a vision in our mind of what a well run classroom for our standards is. And what does that require from students and from ourselves too, because it's a partnership. And again, if the students are not pulling their weight, we're the ones responsible.
That's right.
So, how
That's
are we
right.
going to make this work, right?
Exactly. So I did want to talk a little bit about how and why experiencing limits is actually critical and good, not just good, but critical for kids.
So, again, it's a very natural, biologically ingrained in us as humans to need the sense of order because it creates the sense of stability. Now, as children develop and grow up, what's allowed has to be expanded, right? But still, as we expand things and give kids more freedoms, we also make them more aware of their own responsibilities. So there will be limits set, right? So,
Right.
yes, this new thing is okay. This next thing is okay too. So, a lot of how we talk about boundaries, what's okay, what's not okay, we're saying, oh, yeah, now you're older or now you're more responsible. I can give you this freedom and you can have this. So, more of the things become available and become okay, but at the same time, as we expand that circle, the boundary around that circle of what's okay also is expanding. Yes, it's okay to do this, but at the same time, it's not okay to do XYZ. So, for example, we may send a student who is really responsible to the office and have them be able to be in charge of a job. Very important task, to go from this floor to that floor, from this place to the office and deliver something. So that is a privilege, it's a freedom, that's okay. We're expanding the kind of the boundaries for them. At the same time, it's not going to be okay to go poke your face in another classroom and make kind of, jokes or funny faces or whatever, right? That would not be okay. And that limit will come with this new expansion. So they kind of go hand in hand. And why it's good to experience limits, it's because, again, we are raising the child's awareness of how can they go about doing things that they want to do, or being able to enjoy the privileges they have without compromising other people's freedom to do what they want to do or can do or allowed to do. I mean, ultimately, the boundary is so that we are free to do and live the way we want to without imposing ourselves on other people.
Sure.
And that's kind of the sense of boundaries personally, but also in the community and when we're around other people, right? So a limit is one of the ways to remind people that this is how we do things. This is the way to do things. And we're not doing them the other way because think about any limit we set, because it's ultimately either not going to be safe or not going to be respectful or considerate of other people. This behavior is not appropriate for this time because we have a different goal, right? So there's always a purpose for that. And so that's another thing to remember. Anytime we set a limit, we have to have a clear understanding of why the limit is there. And when students don't follow through, it's easier to have a conversation about it instead of, I said so, right?
Okay.
And in the classroom, we do this. And it's really is helpful to add more to that to say, because here's the reason we're focusing on that, or this is our goal, whatever the issue may be, or the limit may be, in a particular scenario. Yeah.
And do you think, and I'm just thinking out loud here, do you think that as you're setting limits, I'm just thinking of my own kids, and that idea of having some sort of limits or boundaries for your children, the same thing in the classroom. So you've got this idea of, this is what you need to do, and here's what's being required of you, and you can do this. Yes, you have the privilege to be able to sit over here in this particular seat. We're having some chance to kind of choose where you sit, but this is what needs to get accomplished. And when children don't actually meet the expectation, now you have, and as you said, you do have a place to start beginning that conversation, and that you have a framework and you have something there for them to say, remember that this was, the expectation, and, you received this privilege, but now you've not met that expectation. Don't you feel like it's a chance for them to grow, but also to learn how to take more responsibility for themselves in their life?
Absolutely. Again, we want to empower our children and the students in the classroom, right? So, by clearly defining what the expectation is and giving them options as to how they want to do it or when, whatever is appropriate, right? Because we don't want it to be so strict, there is no sense of agency.
Sure.
That's something we need to help our students develop, because that with the sense of agency comes the motivation. They will want to do it the best way they can because they feel proud of their work, or it goes beyond pleasing the teacher and really wanting to be, like I said, proud of themselves, right? But if we don't create that space of having the balanced conversation of, here's why I have this expectation, right? To have them understand that the purpose and the goal is common. We share something similar when we set that expectation. I really would like for you to finish this worksheet because I really want you to be skilled, or I want you to have an easier time doing X, Y, and Z. Wouldn't you want the same? Right? So, kind of getting on the same page first as far as the expectation. If the expectation is going to be rejected out the get go, it's going to be hard to get the student on board. Doesn't mean that we're going to remove the expectation, right? But we need to understand that if they're not on board with it, it's just going to be harder to implement it. So, then there's not going to be a buy in. But when there is a buy in because they see the bigger purpose, and we can help them decide how they're going to meet that expectation, there you go. You're inviting them again. What are your thoughts about this? I really need this to be done. You have only this much to complete, or whatever. What's the best way to do it? And just really inviting them to share their thoughts and their ideas about how they may want to go about meeting the expectation.
Sure.
And it is a learning process, like you're saying, if this is truly an expectation, then I'm being called to be responsible to meet the expectation. And when I meet it, I will feel great because, again, we as adults need to give that feedback. This was so responsible of you to, I know you didn't want to do this, but you just committed to it and you've done it, or whatever the language you want to use. I know you really want to do something else and this was boring and it's kind of easy for you, but I really needed to check on this, right? Like if you,
Right.
I don't know, if you can go do your math facts real quick. I just needed to check this for myself. Thank you for doing this for me. Whatever is the language that we can acknowledge that they were responsible with the expectation, we're building their sense of self. So whether they like it or not, the expectation itself, the experience of doing it is not a negative one. In the end, it's a net positive because they've
Sure.
learned something about themselves. You can really do it. If
Sure.
they're not complying with an expectation and we have a good reason for it and they still don't want it, well, we have to decide, okay, how many things are we going to go and have a battle about? And then really focus on really important things, right? And kind of decide in our head, it's not always going to be our way. And when it is our way, is it worth it? And if it is, then again, clearly articulating, I will insist on this. I know you really don't like this. I will insist on this. We really need to get this done. So I'm just curious, what's the best way to do it? I will always, myself, I will always invite the child, tell me, is there a better way? Because this expectation is not going away. I really need you to do it. Here's the reason why. Just what's the best way? What are you thinking?
Right. And I think it's interesting because when you say that, because one of the things that I see a lot in the classroom as I in various schools and districts, the one thing that I see is that there are more and more children who come from backgrounds where maybe they've not had a lot of limits or boundaries in their home and they're coming to
Mhm.
the classroom and they're very resistant to have to. They're very resistant to, and sometimes it's just their social emotional level. They're just on this little personal roller coaster in their life and every day is a different journey. And they may come in one day and they can do all their work and they're fine. But the next day they come in and you don't know, maybe they had mom, dad was upset with them, or they fought with their brother, or their brother tripped them on the way out of the car, or you don't know. And it's just was wrecked their entire day. I mean, it's like a train wreck. You can see them when they
Mhm.
walk in the door. And talking about, you know, telling them, yes, most of what we do is a have to in school, but sometimes we can be a little flexible and say, you know what, obviously you're having a really hard day and I'm just going to set this one aside for right now and we're going to move on and work on these other things and prioritizing a little bit. I think that's really is a strong and effective way to kind of mitigate some of those things for the child and to help them understand that yes, it is important, but this is more important, so we're going to prioritize here and say this one's more important. But then also enlisting them in their help and saying, look, we have to get this done. You don't have to show me that you know this in this way. If you have a different way that you can think of to show me that you really understand this, I will listen. We'll see if that will be a good way.
Mhm.
That's not necessarily negotiating for less. You're just getting some buy-in. And I think it's brilliant. It's another way to really say, hey, let's figure this out so that you can actually show me instead of being so hard and fast and like, here's the worksheet, do the worksheet.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about here is really creating a partnership, right?
Mhm.
Because again, if we are focusing on what we need from them, we will miss on hearing what is it that they need from us. Maybe they just need to be acknowledged and to be seen because in the hustle and bustle of getting out of the house, someone didn't hear them today, this morning. Someone, maybe they were calling, Mom, I wanted that, but no one heard them. And all they want is just someone to look in their face and smile and say, what's up? How are you doing today? Maybe that's all they needed. But if we're all kind of so focused on what we need from them, we'll miss that. And if the child feels the connection to an adult, they will do the best that they can to get over and be done with that expectation as soon as they can, because we're going to make it possible for them to do. And if we're inviting them to tell us how they want to do it, that will work with us. So if it's not working, there's a power struggle and it's not working, I would say step back and ask, do you have a connection here?
Right.
Where are we missing what the child might be needing from us? And
Sure.
check in. And it's okay to say, even in that moment, to say, you know what? It feels to me like we're stuck. Do you feel like we're stuck? And you can say this to a 5-year-old or you can say it to a high school student. It doesn't matter. How does this feel to you? I feel like we're butting heads. Are we stuck? What do you think? And if
Yes.
there's that invitation, and we're not gonna get mad at them when they share really what they think and feel, they
Right.
will feel that there is a space and they will share. And that is the moment to listen to what is it they might need from us? How can we be helpful? And when that connection is there, of course, they will jump in and they will do what they need to do. Now, we might be thinking, well, I don't have 5 minutes to spend on this. Think of that as 5 hours of gain time the next time you will ask that student to do something.
Yes.
The investment that will pay off long
Right.
term.
Yeah. And I agree 100%. I think that, and you might see this as one instance, and it's like, I really need this done, and we just got to move on. And it's easy in a classroom. I say a classroom, as teachers, we live our lives at 100 miles an hour all day long.
Mhm.
But
Yes.
sometimes we have to press the brake, right? And
Mhm.
just stop for a minute and take a minute to take a breath and take the temperature in the room and just see what's going on, because we miss so much of what's going on. And what we're missing is all of that social emotional stuff that's inhibiting students from actually learning. And maybe they're not actively being oppositional, but they can, in quiet ways, kind of get their own back in little tiny ways. And it creates an undercurrent in the classroom. It's hard to one pinpoint it, but also it's hard to fix that once it starts going around. And it can bleed from one day to the next. And having a chance to just take the temperature and say, wait a minute, this is kind of happening over here. If I can get this child to find a way to work through this, they're going to be happier and more compliant through the rest of the day and the next day, because they knew that I listened to them and I saw them. And so now they're on board and they know I care.
Mhm.
And it's
Yeah.
every moment, every interaction is building that relationship.
Absolutely. And you are really investing with every conversation and interaction we have with a student. We are investing in that partnership. Like, it's unbelievable. It may feel like a waste of time initially because, hey, they should just know that they listen to teachers. But really, especially if we think about our day and age, again, you're saying some students may be coming from homes that don't have many limits, but also in general, especially if we're talking about middle schoolers or high schoolers, and upper elementary years as well, they all have their phones, right? They're kind of exposed to this notion of, I have access to the world, I know some things better than other people. There's more of the questioning of the authority status. This is in general, as a society, this group of children are really looking at things in a different way. So we have to acknowledge that the only way to get them to do something will be through a partnership, not the top down tiered approach like that. Of course, internally in our mind, we have to be the ones who are leading the class, who are in charge, because ultimately we are responsible. But we have to also be flexible to understand that with this group of students now, you can't talk this way and you can't just expect by default that that's going to be how things go, because that's no longer the playbook, right? Love that analogy you used with the 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
That is, in fact, the case, right? But even if we're thinking, just to stick with that analogy, like if we are driving on the highway and we're flying because whatever, we have a million things to do, we're still not going to ignore the basic rules of the road.
That's right.
And so, social emotional environment in the classroom is one of the rules of the road. You cannot proceed with content, proceed with lessons, proceed with skill building if you don't have the foundation of, I'm ready to learn. And so when students push back, when they don't follow through with an expectation, it is because we have a mismatch of needs. See, I want them to succeed. I'm focusing on their scholastic skills, but if they're not at that level, if they have a basic need for attention that was not met, or they're hungry, they didn't eat properly, or they didn't sleep properly, like it's basic biological needs are not met for them, we have a mismatch. They're not at the level of like, yeah, I want to have fun learning. No, that's not their priority right now, right? So
Right.
those are some of the cues that need to tell us. It's like the traffic light when we're speeding on the road. If the right is led, we're gonna stop no matter what. Even if it's coming to a screeching halt, we're gonna do that because there's a signal that says something is not working. Stop, stop, stop.
Right. Yeah. And that's exactly right. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because That is social emotional stuff is actually one of the most important things in the entire school year. And
Mhm.
so many children are missing a lot of those skills, but also children are just children and they have good days and bad days just like adults, but they tend to be more extreme than adults are. Their highs are higher, their lows are lower because they just are still figuring things out and they don't feel like they have a lot of control
Mhm.
about things. They do feel like a lot of times that they're at the mercy of adults, and helping to build that partnership early on in the school year is really is it's the foundation that you're building before you even get into a lot of the content. Yes, you're teaching content from day one, but you're doing it differently on day one in that first week in a more fun and engaging way, maybe. And you're kind of sliding it in a little bit more as opposed to really hitting hard. And then it starts to get a little, you start ramping up from there. But really, it takes longer than a week to build that base, doesn't
Yeah, absolutely. And not just that, but students continue to have their lives, right? So there might be things that have happened for them today, and they were fine the first 2 months of the school year. They're not immune to peer conflicts, right? Everything might have been great. So if you're an elementary school teacher and you have your class with you the whole day, they came in fine, but then something happened in the second part of the day, and so if we're not taking like the classroom temperature, if you will, like how are we doing? How are things going? And we're not scanning the room for, are my students still with me? Are they still available for learning? Are the needs matching what I want for them versus what they want from me? Then we're going to be missing those things, right? And so the content, our ultimate goal to teach them some skills, is not going to land in the right place. And that's a critical thing. And I think if we go into the classroom with that mindset of scholastic skills are as important as their development as a person, we're going to have such an easier time teaching content, because what are we doing? We're seeing them as human beings first and foremost before they're students in our classroom. The number one need kids have is attention. If we can give them that personalized attention, it doesn't require much. It's when things are broken that we need to spend more time repairing and building connection. But if all we're doing is saying their names, smiling at them, maybe giving them a high five, whatever is appropriate, just saying thank you. I see that you finished your work. Thank you. Instead of like, well, you're supposed to do it anyway, so please put your worksheet over here, right? Sometimes we think that that's kind of tone indicates authority. Actually, authority is in the consistency of expectation. It's not in the tone necessarily. I'm going to tell you what to do and I'm not going to smile and my face is going to be flat.
it?
That's an illusion of authority. That's really going to create a disconnect. And again, if you have people who are having a good time, it doesn't mean they're monkeying around in the classroom, but they just feel like they can trust you, they know what's coming. It's going to be so much easier to work with them. Why not have that
Right?
going on in our classroom,
Right,
right?
right. Well, who doesn't want to live in an environment every day that you actually enjoy being in? I mean, who wants to be, the taskmaster all day long? I mean, nobody wants that,
Mhm.
right? And I think that tends to be what a lot of people think of when they think of boundaries or limits is I got to be the
Mhm.
taskmaster. I have to kind of be on them every minute and that's not who I want to be. And I don't want to be that teacher. I always hated those teachers. I think that's what's going on as opposed to this idea of no, these are natural places where we say, stop, that's not okay. It's not okay,
Mhm.
not just for you, but it's not okay for our community, and we're building this community and we want it to be a place where we can all just be free and happy. And boundaries actually liberate us.
I think of them as like a game, any game, board game or a game outdoors. Boundaries are the rules. And so these are the rules of the game, and this is how we play the rules. Basically, they are the rules of how this classroom functions. And if we follow the rules, we get to enjoy the game, right? And if someone is breaking the rules, we stop them to remind them, hey, we're playing this and these are the rules, right? And so when we have everybody's buy in, the community will step in. You don't have to be the only one always to be reminding of the rules. If the rules are fair and they're working, half of the class will pitch in and say, hey, actually, we're doing this right now. That's why. Or like, this is how you do this process, or this is how we do this transition. And they will help support it because that's the rules of the game. I know that when we think about limits, I'm setting a limit, it sounds very negative. But if we approach it from the standpoint of boundaries is really natural, right? Like how we started talking about that. It's very natural, it's needed. It helps create the sense of predictability and consistency. And that consistency is what builds our authority and allows to create partnership. And there's nothing bad about it. And limits is rarely something we will bring up openly with a student. We will talk about the rules of the game, right?
Right.
But we will have fewer cases or instances where we have to talk about violation of rules and therefore the limits are set and therefore maybe a consequence is set, right? It's unlikely to be there if we're really clear about what are the rules because we want to have fun. These are the rules so that everyone is on the same page. And when the rules are broken, there's not going to be a conversation about consequences right away. We're just going to re-engage about, okay, let's read the rules again. Like, what are the rules, right? It happens in any game. So like, I love thinking about that from that perspective of that metaphor.
Right. Well, and I love the idea of a board game. I think that that to me is a good image for kids. Is that idea of playing a board game? Who hasn't ever played a board game and then suddenly had someone who's trying to break the rules and everyone stops and you can't do that. And they
Mhm.
all jump in because it ruins the game. Because if you can do that, that's not fair to me or any of these other people. And you're setting yourself up to win unfairly, right? And
Right.
kids can understand a board game. So
Mhm.
talking about your rules and that idea of, you know, well, this is why we have them and why and how this makes it more fun for us because then we can all just play. If everybody's obeying the same rules, then we can all just play and have a good time. Boy, does that take a lot of the trying to get that idea across to kids. So it takes it out of the equation because they understand the game for
Yeah,
sure.
and it's not negative, right? We don't say, okay, we're
No.
going to play a game and these are the limits. And it's the same thing. We're setting boundaries as to what's okay and what's not okay. That's the boundary. This is okay, that's not okay. It's all in the delivery, right? If we are going to have a negative connotation to what we're talking about, we're going to be delivering a negative message. Don't do this. Don't. Stop. That's going to be negative. Let's talk about how we want things to go. These are the rules. This is how we can predictably have fun in this space, right?
Right.
And again, like sometimes the rules of the game can change. I mean, how many times you've played a game and you're like, okay, let's tweak a rule here. Is everybody on board? Let's do that just for fun. So we can do that again, remembering that we are ultimately responsible and we have to get the whole community on board. Otherwise, it's not a fair game and we can't play. But that's another point to the boundaries and the rules is that those things are flexible and gives the students the sense of agency. Well, let's try it. Let's try this different rule. We're still going to maintain these ones because they do make sense, but let's try this one as well and see how it goes.
Yeah, love the idea of the board game. It gives that perfect image to students. They totally can understand that. I like the idea that you
Mhm.
can say, and we do say throughout the school year, you know what, this is not working for us. It just feels like
Mhm.
it's rubbing us the wrong way, or it's not working. Maybe we need to adjust this rule, or maybe we need to just completely change it. And we're going to try for just today. I think, especially young teachers who have not been teaching a long time, or maybe you just have a very different class than you've ever had before, we can be so afraid to change the rules. We get really stuck and focused on, no, I can't do that. I'll confuse them. But it's how you present it. It really is. And you can say that we're going to try this just for today and see if this works better for all of us. This is because we're all agreeing it's not cheating. It's not, we're all going to
Yeah.
agree that this is how we're going to try it today and just see how it goes. And at the end of the day, we'll talk about it and decide if we want to keep with that or if we want to go back to the old way if it really was better that way.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect way to talk to any age student. They can all understand that. And there's been times where we played board games like Sorry and said, oh no, and completely changed the rule and said, no, you can steal someone out of their home. You know, you can steal,
Mhm.
or whatever it is. We're going to play the game backwards, you know, whatever,
Mhm.
but everyone agreed in the beginning.
Right. And that's what makes it fair. And what you're talking about really is communication. You don't just flip the switch and now you have different rules. Like classroom comes in, new rules. Here's the thing on the board, read it. It's your responsibility to know the law. No, it's a community, it's a partnership. So it's our responsibility to communicate to them what are the rules, maybe even invite them in the process of like, how's this going, right? Like what you were talking about earlier. So communication is key. And when you have open communication, then what you're facilitating there is really the sense of trust, right? I'm not here to set you up. I'm not here to win the game at your expense. And that again, can you have a partnership without trust? No. So when we're doing this, again, it's working for us. So it's okay to change things if they're not working. It's okay to solicit feedback or input. And ultimately, when we do communicate, that puts the authority back to us because we're showing how comfortable we are. We're not at all concerned or afraid that our status will change. It's actually our sense of being in control that allows us to stay flexible. It's the people who are so afraid about losing control that stay so tightly within the constraints of their rules that are not even working for them, right?
Right. Actually, I'd like to talk about that for a second, that idea of being so tightly in control. And I think a lot of times it's a new teacher thing, but it isn't always. I mean, sometimes we can feel that way in different circumstances for whatever reason. We maybe we weren't that way before, but now all of a sudden we're really feeling that way, different circumstances in our life or something. And we really have this need, or that we think we have this need to be really tightly in control. How does that work in the classroom? It to me works against me all year long, or forever long I cling to that. Talk about what that does to kids and just the dynamic in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. What a good question there. So I'm thinking of this as we can tell ourselves it's working for us, but really we want to be asking more and more, is it really working? Or for how long is it going to work like that? Because when we're in control so much, we're holding things, we're the ones responsible to hold it together because it's not a natural thing that holds itself together. There aren't the rules that kind of facilitate that sense of order. We are the ones that have to hold it together, otherwise it will like fall apart, right? Then we have to ask ourselves, do I have the stamina, the energy to be the one that's holding all of it together? We really need the sense of community that holds the order together because the rules make sense, the expectations make sense. I feel like we need to have so much control and control everything. It is because we have not established clear boundaries. Think about that in terms of like a metaphor of a fenced out yard, and you let your dog go in that yard. Go free, go run around, no leash. But if we don't have the fence, we're going to be holding the dog on the leash, and the dog is going to want to go out and run, and we're going to be the ones holding the dog. And if the dog is pretty compliant, fine, you may not even realize that holding it and being in control is a problem. But if it's a dog that needs to move, oh boy, you are in trouble, right? So you only feeling like you got this until you have no control over it anymore, right?
Right,
Like you
right,
let go of the leash and that's it. It breaks right there. So it can
right.
go from 100 to 0. So really it's asking ourselves proactively, okay, I'm holding this right now, but is it really working for me long term? Or for how long can I hold this? We put our books on the shelf. We don't hold the shelf. The shelf is being mounted on the wall, right? But could we potentially hold it? Sure, we could. Is it serving us? No, because we could be doing other things. So imagine yourself in the classroom as a teacher telling Johnny, don't do this. Lizzie, stop that. Sam, turn around. Like if we're doing this all the time, we're controlling every single piece of it. What are we missing out on?
Right.
Checking in, giving attention, positive attention, right? The kind that builds connection and partnership. And we're missing the opportunity to teach content because we're constantly redirecting, constantly managing, constantly controlling. So that goes back to I did not set the proper boundaries, did not set the expectations, the sense of community, the rules of the game for this class. That's why I need to tell everybody when you roll the dice, you do this, right? Like, no, 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 don't move your piece over here. We're back to that board game analogy, right?
Right. But it's
So,
true.
yeah. Are you going to enjoy the game if people don't know the rules and you're going to have to tell every player what their move is? That's exhausting.
Right. And it's no fun for anyone. It's not even fun for them because they are in this constant feeling of, okay, I don't even know what to do next. When kids are in a classroom and they're afraid to make a step left or right, then they either give up and just do whatever they want, or they're stuck and they're so busy worrying about that their cortex is so busy they can't learn because they're too worried about making a mistake and getting in trouble.
Absolutely. And when we are the ones that are controlling everything, I mean, what kind of energy do we come to that with? It's probably not positive, right?
Stress,
So
right?
stress, right? We might even be like angry or resentful. Like, why do I have to do all this? Students by now, it's March, should be able to blah, 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 right? So,
Right.
again, asking what else can support the order, the sense of order in the classroom. And it's not me. What besides me can support that? Because when we don't have order, that's when we go into the control mode, and that's not going to serve us.
No, it doesn't serve us or our students for sure. So let's start to wrap up just a little bit. But before we do that, maybe just let's talk about few things that we as teachers or as the adults can be doing to help start to train and build that foundation. Maybe there's a few steps that we can take to kind of get us on the right track. Not to say that that's the end all be all, but let's take the first few steps.
I mean, we always have to start with, how do I want to feel? How do I want to feel at the end of the school year? How do I want to feel at the end of every day? How do I want to feel when I'm walking into the classroom? So if we end up setting up ourselves for the kind of experience that is exhausting at the end of every day, we will not be walking into a classroom with open heart, excitement to see our students, right? So get in touch with that feeling. Why are you in this profession? What led you to make that choice? And I know this is like, really, like, why do we have to go that far? But every year you're going to face challenges. And so for us to be able to overcome those and stay on the path and do our mission, we have to get in touch with that deeper sense of, what's my service and why? Why am I doing this? What do I really love about this work? Those are the things that will get us through challenging meetings, unhappy parents, students who are disrespectful, disruptive, you name it, for whatever other reasons. But those hurdles we will overcome if we remember the sense of purpose, why we're doing this. And so when we get in touch with that sense, we can ask ourselves, okay, how can I show up and what can I do to have that sense of, what is it? The sense of purpose, sense of joy. What is it for every person? It's a very individual. How do I want to feel when I walk into my classroom or when I leave my classroom? Some people will say, I want to feel like I have made an impact. Some will say, I want to feel joyful. Some will say, I want to feel calm or energized. Every person will want a different feeling. But once you have it, ask yourself, what can I do to create that feeling in my classroom? What kind of things will have to have happened in my class to make me feel that way? Do I want students to interact with each other more? Do I want my students to show their creativity? Or do I want my students to be more orderly? Okay, how can I teach that to them, right? How can I set up my classroom that way? Because order is important to me. Clean desks are important to me. Just like whatever is the need for every person, get in touch with that. Because we are the ones responsible, and we can, while still being flexible, we can still be setting up our class the way we want it and invite students to participate in those expectations and in that community, while also making their own impact, right? So not every day the desks will be clean and everything like that, or not every day the students will be creative, or not every day they will be willing to do a group project, right? Whatever that is. But get in touch with, what is that feeling you want? What needs to happen action wise on a daily basis to create that sense? And what are the actions we then need to take to make sure that we are facilitating that action from our students? So that happens way ahead of the school year, but also have a reflection moment as you go through the school year and through the week and the month, and say, how did the day go? You are not always going to have that sense of like 100%, I nailed my feeling today. But staying mindful that this is the feeling you still want will keep you aware and see the opportunities of making little tweaks that will bring you back to that sense that you wanted.
I love
And
that.
not to, like, once we know what we want, it's easier to say, this is okay, this is not okay. And this is how I want to do my class, and establish some boundaries around that.
Sure. Well, and I think that's right. I love the idea of a feeling because it really does come down to feelings all the time, doesn't it? And so when you talk about that idea of being things orderly, I think sometimes as teachers we deny what it is that's really important to us. And sometimes orderly feels almost like, gosh, I shouldn't really want that. These are children. But if you have that great need, then have an orderly classroom, because the happy teacher is a good teacher. And if you're happy, it'll be good. But if you're
Mhm.
not happy, it's not going to be well. It's just not. It's going to be a
Yeah.
terrible thing. And I really do believe very strongly in that. And it's the same as a parent. A happy parent's a good parent. If you're not happy, then things are going to go wrong at a much higher rate and much faster than they will if you're happy. Not to
Yeah.
say life is going to be all unicorns and rainbows
Mhm.
if you're happy, but at least you got a better shot at coming at it and really achieving your goals. But starting with that feeling and then knowing what's important to you, I think is
Mhm.
really, really important. So thank you for saying that. From that point on, once you've done all of those things, in addition to continually reflecting throughout the year, which I always advocate for, because you just can't grow and things are going to go wrong. But from that point, would you start to build that list of, okay, so what are my boundaries? What around this is really important in our classroom? And start to build your rules from there, which we all
Mhm.
do ahead of time when we come up with our set of rules. And it seems to be kind of a standard. But sometimes, if you already know a feeling, your rules might look very different than they did in the
Mhm.
past, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say too, with that feeling idea, and I will answer your question, but I just had another thought to add that it's okay to ask the students what kind of feeling do they want to have at the end of the school day, and then check in with them on a scale of 1 to 10, and go do a circle, whatever is the proper format. How you feeling today with the feeling you wanted, right? So it again builds a sense of community and acknowledgement of them as human beings. So that's just as an aside. But yes, so once you kind of know what you want, you can sort of look at what kind of rules you want to establish in your classroom. Sometimes if that's hard, getting in touch with what you want, people can start thinking from the place of what do I not want. I'm sure that every teacher, even a new teacher, has had an experience that was unpleasant. So not to shy away from that, but explore what in that experience was really unwelcomed, unpleasant, uncomfortable. Is it about building some skills that you might need? And that will continue throughout the year, but you might put a kind of like a mental note to yourself, okay, I think I need a little bit more skills here. Maybe how to establish a connection with a student, or how to, maybe if it's a time to set a limit and maybe a time to even speak about consequences. How do I do that so that I don't break my relationship? All these little mental notes on the skills we might need. But if we go back to the rules, think about what you want, think about what you don't want. Do you need any skills to help yourself make that happen? But at any point, whatever is your list, make it positive. Flip it. If I don't want this, what's the opposite of that I do want? Because we
Right.
want to continue communicating positive messages, not don't talk, be quiet, but please raise your hand. That's a more positive message.
Sure.
We really want to tell the students what we want from them, because we are like ingraining in their heads. The message is the one that they will hear all the time, is the message of the things we want them to do versus the opposite, because they hear it all the time and they forget do not part of it, right? Do not run. What they hear is run, 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 run. But if we
Interesting.
keep saying please walk, that's a different message. And they hear please walk, 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 walk.
That's true. Well, and I think when you approach something from a positive, you're being very clear about what the expectation is. But if you approach it from the negative, there's a lot of room in that, what you didn't say. Okay, so I'm not supposed to run, but maybe I could skip, or maybe I could do this, or maybe I can pretend I'm jumping rope, or whatever. And it can turn into quite a fiasco, can it? Because there's a lot of latitude there. But if the rule is please walk, then walking's the only option
Mhm.
versus all of these other options. So there's the other side of that, is that positive message is very clear, and it
Mhm.
has its own little set of boundaries around it, doesn't it? It's just like, this is it. You can walk. That's the only thing that we're saying that you can do here.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Yes, absolutely. And I would also say if your list is long, narrow it down to 5 things. You should not have more rules than 5, because every student should be able to count them on one hand. So there are some rules that can be built under one umbrella. And so look for those themes and how can you tie 2 or 3 rules together under one. Okay. Instead of having a rule about things go over here and these things go over here and whatever about like classroom order kind of part of that,
Right.
instead have a general rule about tidying up the classroom. But that's very specific though, right?
Right, and you would train your students what that means.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
comes into those first month of school of really training your systems and your expectations in within that for sure. And that's something I think teachers already do so much of. And one of my rules is always respect. That encompasses so many things, right? But we talk
Yes.
about the respect of property, respect of other
Mhm.
people, respect of, and those kinds of things. You can define it within that, but being
Mhm.
respectful pretty much covers almost everything, right? It
Yeah.
really does. And I think if you can train students what respect means, then they start to look at things differently and say, that was not respectful of me. And it's a different
Mhm.
conversation altogether in your classroom. And young children can talk that way too, for sure.
Yeah. And something we also spoke of earlier, but I want to just like bring it back as we wrap up this conversation is the part of being able to communicate the why behind your rules. Because that's again is another beautiful opportunity to make a connection with a student who may not be as excited about following that expectation or that rule, right? We
Right.
have to be able to have a clear sense of why we have that rule and how is it serving everybody. Why is this part of the game? Because sometimes, especially if some teachers are new to this, we might be copying other people's rules, but we don't stand behind them clearly ourselves. And that's really important. That's okay if those rules are resonating with us and we copy that, but we then need to do our own checking of the why. How am I going to explain this to a student who doesn't want to follow the rule? Another thing I was thinking is once you have the rules, imagine students following the rules and also imagine students not following the rules. How are we going to address both? So maybe some of the rules are not as important. Are you willing to go to battle for that? So
Right.
again, modify the list, put only the important things, uncompromisable things on that list.
Right. That's right. You can have a lot of things on your list, and a good way to whittle it down a little bit is to say, am I willing to go to battle over that? Is that
Mm,
something worth dying over?
yeah.
If it is, then it needs to be on your list. But if it's not something that you're willing to go to battle over, then maybe you need to take that off of your list of rules for sure.
Yeah.
And you can certainly encompass that within another rule. You're right. To say this is important to me and I do want this to happen, but I'm not willing to die over it. And
Mhm.
there's times I'm going to let that go because there's something else that's more important. Wow, we could go on and on, but Julia, we do need to wrap up. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I just really have so enjoyed talking to you as always. So we'll definitely have to have another conversation another time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here and such an important conversation.
It is.
Really happy to have been part of it. Thank you.
So, there you have it, my friends. I hope that this conversation was helpful to you and that you found something of value in this. I know I certainly enjoyed speaking with Julia and learned so much, as always, when I speak with her. You can find Julia at www.theparentingpresence.com. All the links to Julia's information and any resources mentioned in this episode are in the show notes on my website at www.hopeineducation.com/podcast. So that's it, my teacher friends. We are out of time and I'm definitely out of breath today. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you liked today's episode, I'd love it if you'd go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen and leave a review. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. Also, you can continue the conversation online with me in my Facebook group, the Teach Joyfully podcast community, where elementary teachers can connect, get help, and encouragement for all kinds of education and parenting topics. You can find the show notes on my website at www.hopeineducation.com/podcast. And remember, a happy teacher is a good teacher. Until next time, teach joyfully and take care of you.